I'm Mythili Rao. I'm the lead producer on Today in Focus, which is The Guardian's new daily current affairs podcast. 6 months ago, I was in New York. I was a producer on the New Yorker Radio Hour. And then my last day of work was one day in August. A week later, moved to London. And then the following Monday, started work on what at that point The Guardian was still just calling its flagship podcast. So it's kind of one of those people who, you go somewhere for a weekend and you sort of imagine, oh, wouldn't it be great to live here? That is what I did. And it just sort of started the next Monday. So it's been a whirlwind since we launched on November 1st. How many of you listened to the podcast? Yeah, so a handful. And you know what we're doing then? We're a daily program. The show comes out every morning at 6 a.m. Or a little earlier. We're 20 minutes in length, and typically 17 minutes of that is one main meaty news story tied to something, a headline kind of item that we do a deep dive in for about 15 minutes with the host anchoring and asking questions, a lot of archive, a lot of sound. The second story is something shorter, comment or analysis type piece that's 3 or 4 minutes, more of a monologue, either one of the opinion writers at The Guardian kind of sounding out, or sometimes a reporter just narrating part of their journey through walking along the migrant caravan on the border of Texas and the US, that kind of thing. Sorry, making all these cough drop sounds. We cover national news, international news. More than half of the show's audience is not in the UK. So a big chunk of our listeners are here in the UK, but we're also cognizant that The Guardian occupies this place where people around the world rely on it for kinds of coverage that other news sources don't necessarily offer. And so that's something we try to be cognizant of in the show as well. And the New York Times called the podcast cheeky yet serious, which is kind of, I think, everything that we want to be. This is our host, Anushka Asthana. She used to be The Guardian's political editor, and we're also hosted once a week by India Rakison, who is at the BBC for a long time and is also really fantastic. It is very handy in this political climate to have a host who is a former political editor and knows what phone numbers to dial on Westminster. So why launch a daily news podcast? That graphic there is from a recent article that The New Yorker ran by Jill Lepore in January. I think the print headline was Hard News. The online headline was Does Journalism Have a Future? And a lot of the issues that you heard about before in the presentation right before mine. How does this industry survive in the future? What does that look like? What are the funding models? What are the ways in which journalism can be done sustainably? And we all know it's a pretty confusing and scary time. Just earlier this month, 2,000 people lost their jobs at Vice, BuzzFeed, the Huffington Post, Gannett, McClatchy, and it's an interesting and even more kind of dystopian thing to think about because those represent both some old media companies, the McClatchy, the Gannett, and companies that were supposed to have found new solutions about how to bring news to a digital audience and how to both make money and have a thriving, robust journalism operation. So I think there are a lot of bright spots and there are things that are working, but I would say on the whole, the industry doesn't quite know what its own future is going to be like. One of the bright spots has been that podcast listenership is steadily increasing. And that's the other chart there. These are US stats from Pew, but I know the UK numbers are pretty similar. And it's still a relatively young medium that people can access for free if you have a smartphone and if you have some downtime. So in some ways, it's kind of a no-brainer to start a daily news podcast. The other thing being just the enormous success that the New York Times' podcast, The Daily, had in the US. They, last I checked, had 1 million listens a day. which is pretty extraordinary. And we're making ad revenue in the low 8 figures is what they expected to make last year. So that certainly makes publishers and newsroom leaders kind of sit up straight and think we should try to capture a piece of this. And again, I have no idea where this industry is going to be 5 years from now. But at the moment, this is where listeners, this is where people are turning to find their news. And so how do you launch a daily news podcast? And there are not very many bullet points here because it's really a mystery to me even now exactly how we did it. The first thing, assembling the right team. Our particular team included a lot of former BBC journalists, a handful of longtime Guardian folk, and then I think, as with all projects, creative projects, you don't necessarily know what you're making until you dive into it. And the piloting process was a lot of experimenting with workflow. How many people does it take to put out a show like this each day? Learning the Guardian's audio software. The Guardian has been in podcasting for a very long time, but it also has some old audio systems. I won't get into the nitty-gritty of them, but learning our way around that and figuring out, I think, also how to trust your teammates, what it is you're making, what people's strengths are. And piloting is a little bit of a scary process because you're making something hypothetical on imaginary deadlines for an imaginary audience. And I really think the show kind of clicked. It became clear what we were making and who we were making it for once we launched, and sort of had the pressure of producing and not just kind of imagining and you know, futzing. So one of the things that did come out of our piloting process that I thought might be interesting to share, we did have time to sit around and draw up a lot of questions and big picture ideas on dry erase boards. And these kind of come out of a series of questions we all scribbled down one day. They are not hard and fast rules by any means, but there's some of the things that we try to think about in selecting stories each day. We just kind of colloquially call them our stress tests. Is the story moving forward? Will this story get more people interested in what's going on in the world? Why does it matter that people know this? Will the story leave people thinking? Is there a character at the heart of the story with something big at stake that will kind of keep people, moving along with the story? Have we taken advantage of our medium? Does the audio inherently sound interesting? Is this a story that actually should just be better read? What are we adding as audio journalists? Have we treated the story or place the way we would if it were close to home, which I think is a very important one? And then probably the one that really sets us straight each day is, with all the things competing for people's time, is this story worth it? What is it that we really believe that people should spend 20 minutes of their morning listening to our show to hear about this thing? And again, we're not always reacting to the previous day's news. We're not always, going to be able to tell a story that lines up with what is on the headlines that morning. So we're also thinking a little bit like features editors do and magazine editors do. What is the story that we have something bigger to offer on, that we've got a deeper dive or some new analysis or some new angle that's still connected to the news cycle that people are going to care about? And then finally, one that's, I think, very important to me is, have we struck a balance between complexity and nuance and accessibility? So you want to make things as clear and simple in 20 minutes as possible, but you really don't want to oversimplify. You want to make sure that you're not preventing people who don't know about the Taliban or the Afghan war from listening to your piece, but you don't want to get so mired in explaining all the details that you can't get to the heart of the storytelling. So those are some of the stress tests. A little more about the show itself. I wanted to play, and I might need help from the back to just click on the little play link on Theresa May.
Feel today, Jacob?
How do I feel?
Feel, that's the word I'm looking for.
It's not a matter of feel, is it? It's about details of policy and politics.
You must feel something. It must feel hard
Feel
to do
that we have
do
got
that to the Prime Minister.
well, you've got to do what has to be done. But I campaigned on Brexit. I stood on a manifesto promising Brexit. The Prime Minister's not doing that.
So anyway, as you may have guessed, that particular bit of audio came from the episode we did the day after Theresa May's entire cabinet were announcing their resignations one after another, and Anushka, being a former political editor, just went to Westminster early in the morning as this news started breaking, and spent the day just kind of grabbing MPs as they came, and getting them to talk to her about what was going on and how they felt. And that moment, I think, for me, captures a lot of what I love about what the podcast is doing. And how do you feel is a kind of question that gets a bad rap sometimes, that it's maybe not the most not the most hard facts kind of question, and it's maybe a question that we associate with softer interviews. But in this case, it was the perfect question to kind of really elicit something fundamental. I thought about Jacob Rees-Mogg's character and about the theater of Westminster, and that just comes again from having a host who trusts their instincts, and a show that kind of knows its own identity and isn't afraid to, on a big day of political upheaval, not just ask what are the next policies, who are the new cabinet members, why are you doing this, but also just how do you feel. So I really enjoyed that, and I also enjoyed the lovely video that our marketing team made out of that. And marketing has been a big part of the success of the launch. I just want to share some of the beautiful ads that they made. So from the get-go, the marketing team did a lot of research about the kinds of people who read The Guardian, the kinds of people who listen to podcasts, what their habits are, what time of day do they listen, what kind of stories are they interested in. And these things did not provide, they weren't rules for us to live by, but they were things that we could be aware of. This is what our audience is most likely looking for. And I think are part of why we've been able to find our audience pretty quickly is that there wasn't a product like this in a UK market. And they also make beautiful ads that they paste around London, and some that you may see in the tube soon. So we've been very lucky, I think, to be at an institution that supports what we're doing so much and has thrown a lot of resources to make sure it's not just the new podcast that's buried deep on the third part of the homepage. If you scroll through and you click through the other thing, you'll know where to find it. It's front and center. People can find it. And people in the building are excited about it. It's also been really fun to work with journalists around the world, and people come to us and borrow microphones and want to know how they can record good audio on their iPhones, and record their own segments of the interviews in their hotel rooms, in their closets, under a duvet. Our first episode was recorded by Tom Phillips, the correspondent who is reporting on Jair Bolsonaro, from his hotel room in Sao Paulo under a very warm duvet. He was such a great sport, and managed to also do all of that and tell a really compelling story about what propelled Bolsonaro to his rise that we aired on our first episode. So that, in a nutshell, is what the podcast is, what I do. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mythili. There's a question over there, eager questioner right now. So let's start there.
Hi. What percentage of the people actually finish the podcast to the end? And where do you distribute it? Is it on Echo, on Google Home, Spotify, and so on?
So the first question is a really good one. All things about podcast numbers are kind of mysterious. So most people listen through Apple, so Apple kind of controls all the data around downloads and listen throughs and that kind of thing. We get some of that information. We don't know all of it. I was also sort of advised to not get into too much of the details. So we wonder that too sometimes. And as far as what platforms it's distributed on, it's on iTunes, it's on Apple, it's on Spotify, it's on, what are the other ones? Pocket Cast, I believe. I think we may not be on Stitcher, but we are on Acast. So most of the big platforms, and actually a surprisingly high number of listens come from the Guardian webpage. So a lot of people just listen through the webpage or through the app. You can like play it through the app as well. So I think, yeah, that answered. Or sorry.
Yeah, question in the middle here. Yeah, you can do it too.
Yes.
Have a wait for the mic. It's just coming down the road to you.
I talk loud. Thanks for telling us so much about the creative approach that you took to the podcast. Can you tell us a bit more about the podcast as a product? Like who are you trying to reach? What are your goals? Is it purely like we want to increase exposure of the Guardian brand to a larger listenership, or what are your kind of targets? What are you trying to achieve?
Yeah, no, I think the people from the marketing department can speak to that even more than I can, but I have seen a lot of their presentations and data, and I can kind of give you a rough sense of my understanding of that. I
just mean,
think
but how do you speak to those goals in terms of what you're producing? Like, why do a daily, for example?
why do daily? I think the one reason to do a daily, well, there wasn't another daily in this market really. I think that was a driving factor. For me, I think a daily is interesting to work on because there just is so much news in this current moment, and you have a lot of opportunities to kind of stab at it, and to kind of cover a whole breadth of stuff. You can do in the same week 5 different regions of the world. You can do politics, you can do features, you can do a lot. Just because you have to generate so much content, you're forced to do a lot. So I like that about working on a daily. What's the other part of your question? I'm sorry.
I guess I'm trying to get at how do your creative choices align with some of the goals that the business has?
Yeah, there is a little bit of, I think there's a bit of separation of church and state, but we're also aware that we're making something for an audience. We're not doing the same kind of work that someone whose job it is to cover the court system is, for example. So we do think about, one thing we think a lot about is how are we titling our episodes? Are we titling them in a way that get a click? Because sometimes you may have made a beautiful episode, but no one's going to listen to it if they don't think it sounds appealing. So that is something we spend a lot of time thinking about. Yeah.
We've got a couple of questions over here. So one over this side first.
I just wanted to ask, you've done this for a few hundred episodes now?
Oh.
Or 100 so episodes now?
How many
What
episodes
worked
so
and
far?
what didn't work? What type of stories do you think worked and what type of stories didn't work?
I think our definition of it not working would be that we failed to produce a podcast on a given day. But more broadly, I think along those lines, one thing we've been really aware of is how much manpower and energy it goes into producing this every day. So what kind of stories can we execute without someone being in the office till 3 a.m? And on those days where we are trying to react to political news quickly, we want to do that, and we know listeners want to hear that, but we can't do that every day. So also being strategic, when do we know we can plan out a couple days in advance? There's a news event coming. What interviews can we do ahead of that? And what pieces can we leave for the last minute to sew it all together? So the same kind of decisions that editors and other mediums make, but with the added audio component.
Question in the middle at the back. And then there's one at the front in the corner here.
Hi, it's a question in 2 parts in the end, and you sort of answered part of it in a way. How do you decide on an angle for that story, obviously? Because, I mean, obviously some stories that are developing, you could talk about them a week after they started, but how do you decide on an angle if it's going to be just an explainer? And second part would be, do you rely a lot on the material that the Guardian reporters produce? Obviously, because you're doing a daily podcast, or you do most of it from scratch.
Yeah, we do rely a lot on what's happening at the Guardian, what reporters are doing. Some things we do from scratch. This week there is an interview with David Challen, whose mother killed his father, and those interviews were all things that we did just for the podcast that weren't connected to other. It wasn't an interview that someone had already done. But a lot of what we're doing is connected to things that Guardian reporters are working on. And that informs our angle, our decision on angle. Sometimes we want to play to the strengths of the work that the reporters are already doing. If they have access to a particular person or a place, or we know they're going to go somewhere and can record some of their interviews, or we can go with them, that's great. I mean, the other thing on angle is a bit of a gut test sometimes. Like when we talk about a story idea in our morning meeting, do we collectively think it's interesting? Is it an angle that we hadn't heard before, that's answering some questions that we didn't already understand? So, I mean, the angle, it does have to be a bit of value added. It's not going to be just kind of laying out the facts of a thing. It's got to be, what are those additional layers of questions that someone may not have gotten from just kind of following the headlines? So yeah.
And one final question here at the front, and then we're going to have to wrap it up. Sorry, everyone else.
So one short and one non-short question. Are you available on smart speakers? Is your podcast available on smart speakers?
I believe so. Yes, I think other Guardian podcasts are. Yes, I think
Jeremy
so.
is
Is
also
not.
from The Guardian. He can
Yes,
answer that
He
question.
says yes.
Okay.
And just very good
Yes.
question. How do you monetize podcast? Because that's always tough.
Yeah, so there are sponsors for each season, and they were able to sell out a lot of the first however many 3 months, even before we launched the podcast, just kind of based on the plans for it. So sponsors buy advertisements, and you'll hear a little thing about Twinings tea or whatever our other sponsors are at the moment. Bose headphones, distractions off, focus on. So yeah, so that's the how it works.
Okay, I'm sorry, we're going to have to leave it there for questions and
Thank you
say
so much.
thank you so much, Mythili.
Thank you.